Most people spend their entire lives becoming more like everyone else. They round off their edges, they learn what to say, when to laugh, how to fit, and the world rewards them for it. But every now and then, Jung encountered someone moving in the opposite direction, someone who was becoming less palatable, less predictable, less easy to categorize, and more themselves. Not because they were trying to be different, because something in their psychology wouldn't let them be anything else. Jung studied thousands of patients over the course of his career, and the ones who fascinated him most weren't the ones with the most dramatic symptoms or the most painful histories. They were the ones whose inner architecture was built differently from the start. People whose consciousness operated on frequencies that the majority of the population simply couldn't tune into. He didn't romanticize them. He didn't call them special or gifted in the way the internet throws those words around. What he said was far more interesting and far more unsettling. He said these individuals carried a psychological structure so uncommon that it made ordinary life feel like wearing shoes that were the wrong size. Functional, technically, but wrong in a way that never stopped being uncomfortable. Today I'm going to walk you through the 10 signs Jung identified that indicate an extremely rare personality type. Not rare in some flattering, ego-stroking way, but rare in the way that reshapes how you experience reality, relationships, and yourself. Some of these signs will challenge you, a few might unsettle you, and if most of them describe your inner world with uncomfortable accuracy, it means your psychology is structured in a way that fewer than a handful of people in any room will ever understand. The first sign is that you feel psychologically older than your actual age, and you have for as long as you can remember. This isn't about being mature for your age, or being the responsible one in your friend group. Jung identified something far deeper. He found that certain individuals arrive in the world carrying what he described as an ancient quality in their psyche. A heaviness, a depth, a sense of having already understood things that their peers haven't even begun to encounter. As children, they confused adults, not because they were precocious or trying to seem smart, but because their questions came from somewhere that didn't match their years. Jung connected this to what he called the collective unconscious, the inherited psychological layer that contains the accumulated experience of humanity. Most people access this layer dimly, through dreams and instincts. But individuals with rare personalities seem to have a thinner barrier between their conscious mind and this deeper reservoir. They carry knowledge they never learned. They understand dynamics they've never personally experienced. And this creates a strange kind of loneliness, because when you're 8 years old and already sensing the unspoken grief in a room, the other children are not going to understand you. That gap never fully closes. You grow up, but the distance between your inner experience and everyone else's stays roughly the same. The second sign is that you observe before you react, and often you observe instead of reacting entirely. Jung noticed this pattern repeatedly in his most psychologically unusual patients. Where most people encounter a stimulus and respond almost immediately with emotion, opinion, action, these individuals had an automatic pause built into their processing. Something happened, and before any reaction formed, they watched, not with detachment or coldness, with a kind of deep attention that took everything in before deciding what, if anything, warranted a response. Jung found this wasn't a learned behavior, it was structural. Their consciousness was oriented toward understanding before engaging, which meant they processed events on multiple levels simultaneously. While everyone else was reacting to the surface of a situation, they were already reading the undercurrents, the motivation behind someone's words, the fear beneath someone's anger, the pattern that was about to repeat itself. This made them extraordinarily perceptive, but it also made them slow to speak in a world that rewards fast reactions. People misread their silence as passivity, as indifference, sometimes as arrogance. What it actually was, Jung recognized, was a fundamentally different relationship with incoming information. They weren't failing to react. They were processing at a depth that reaction would interrupt. The third sign is one Jung considered among the most telling. You've lost interest in performing for other people. Not partially, completely. There was a times when you could do it, play the role, hit the social marks, present the version of yourself that made others comfortable. But at some point, something in you stopped being willing, not stopped being able, stopped being willing. The energy it costs to maintain a persona that doesn't match your interior became a price you were no longer interested in paying. Jung wrote extensively about the persona, the social mask everyone constructs to navigate the world. He understood that some degree of persona is necessary for functioning, but he observed that individuals with rare psychological structures reached a point where their relationship to the persona fundamentally changed. Instead of wearing it unconsciously, they became aware of it as a performance. And once you see the mask as a mask, you can't wear it the same way again. It starts to feel suffocating, dishonest, like a betrayal of something essential in you that refuses to be packaged for consumption. Jung found that this refusal terrified the people around them, because when you stop performing, you become unpredictable, and unpredictable people threaten social systems that depend on everyone playing their assigned role. The fourth sign is that you're not just comfortable with solitude, you require it the way other people require social connection. Jung observed that his most psychologically rare patients had a relationship with aloneness that bewildered everyone in their lives. They didn't retreat from the world because they were wounded or avoidant. They retreated because their inner life was so active, so rich, so demanding of their attention, that social interaction often felt like noise interfering with a signal they were trying to hear. This goes beyond introversion. Jung was careful about that distinction. Introversion describes an energy orientation. What he was documenting was something more fundamental, a consciousness that did its deepest work in silence. These individuals processed their most important realizations alone. Their most profound growth happened in solitude. Their relationship with themselves was the primary relationship, and everything else was secondary. Jung noted that this wasn't narcissism or self-absorption. It was a psychological architecture that required periods of withdrawal the way certain plants require darkness to bloom. The problem was that almost no one around them understood this. Solitude in our culture gets interpreted as depression, as antisocial behavior, as something to fix. And these individuals spent years defending their need for it before finally accepting that the need was non-negotiable and the defense was unnecessary. The fifth sign is one that Jung considered a hallmark of genuine psychological maturity, and it's remarkably rare. You can hold two contradictory truths simultaneously without needing to collapse them into one. You can love someone and recognize they're harmful to you. You can grieve a relationship and know leaving was right. You can feel afraid and move forward anyway, not because you've conquered the fear, but because you've learned to carry it alongside your courage without demanding that one cancel the other out. Jung called this the tension of opposites, and he believed it was the engine of all real psychological development. Most people can't tolerate contradiction. It creates anxiety, so they resolve it by choosing a side. This person is good or bad. This decision was right or wrong. I'm either strong or broken. But individuals with rare personalities develop the capacity to sit in the middle, holding the full complexity of a situation without reducing it. Jung observed that this ability emerged only after significant inner work, often unconscious. The psyche had to be strong enough to contain opposites without splitting, and most psyches aren't. Most psyches need the comfort of either or. The rare personality lives in the discomfort of both, and eventually, that discomfort becomes a kind of freedom that people addicted to certainty will never access. The sixth sign is that people feel exposed around you, and they usually can't articulate why. You're not confrontational, you're not intrusive, you might not even be saying much. But something about your presence makes people uneasy in a way that has nothing to do with anything you're doing and everything to do with what you're perceiving. Jung documented this phenomenon extensively. He found that individuals with rare psychological structures carried a quality of attention that penetrated surface behavior automatically. They didn't try to see through people, they just did. Their consciousness was oriented toward depth, which meant they registered the gap between what someone was performing and what someone was actually experiencing. Most people never notice this gap because they're operating on the same surface level. But when someone with penetrative perception enters a room, the people in that room feel it, even if they can't name what they're feeling. They become slightly more guarded, slightly more self-conscious, slightly more performative, or, alternatively, slightly more honest. Jung found this fascinating because it meant that rare personalities changed the psychological atmosphere of any space they entered, not through action, but through the quality of their awareness. People sense when they're being truly seen, and most people, Jung observed, find being truly seen deeply uncomfortable because it threatens the persona they've spent their entire life constructing. The seventh sign is that you've walked away from things most people spend their lives clinging to: relationships, careers, belief systems, identities. And you did it not because you failed at them, but because you outgrew them. Jung called this process individuation, and he recognized it as the rarest form of psychological development because it requires something most people are never willing to do. It requires voluntary loss, not loss that happens to you, loss that you choose because staying would mean betraying something essential in your own becoming. This is what separates the rare personality from someone who's simply restless or avoidant. The rare personality doesn't leave because they're running from something. They leave because they've completed something. The relationship taught them what it was going to teach them. The career revealed what it was going to reveal. The belief system carried them as far as it could carry them. And continuing to stay would mean choosing comfort over growth, a trade the rare personality is constitutionally incapable of making. Jung warned that this pattern would be misunderstood by almost everyone. People would call it commitment issues, instability, selfishness. What it actually was, Jung recognized, was a psyche that refused to stagnate, even when stagnation was the easier, more socially acceptable choice. And if you've been recognizing yourself in these signs, if this isn't just interesting but uncomfortably accurate, then you already know what it's like to navigate a world that wasn't designed for how you experience it. That kind of self-awareness doesn't develop on its own. It takes deliberate inner work. We created a guide called True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises drawn from Carl Jung's teachings, built specifically for people who are ready to stop performing and start understanding the architecture of their own psyche. If you want to take this deeper, click below to get your copy. But right now, let's keep going, because the remaining signs are the ones that even most rare personalities haven't fully understood about themselves yet. The eighth sign is that you don't need to win arguments anymore. There was a time when you did, when being right felt urgent, when proving your point felt necessary, when someone misunderstanding you felt like an emergency that required correction. But something shifted. Jung found that this shift was one of the most reliable indicators of genuine psychological maturity, because it required the ego to relinquish one of its favorite survival strategies. The ego feeds on being right. It draws identity from winning intellectual battles. And for rare personalities, who genuinely do perceive more accurately than most people around them, the temptation to prove this is enormous. But at a certain point, the rare personality recognizes something that changes their relationship with conflict permanently. They realize that most arguments aren't about truth, they're about identity. The other person isn't disagreeing because they've evaluated the evidence differently. They're disagreeing because agreeing would threaten some part of how they see themselves. And once you see that, engaging in the argument feels pointless. Not beneath you, pointless. You can't logic someone out of a position their ego requires them to hold. Jung observed that when rare personalities stopped needing to win, they gained something far more valuable than being right. They gained peace, the ability to hear someone's position, understand why they hold it, recognize where it comes from psychologically, and let it exist without feeling compelled to change it. This isn't passivity. It's the deepest form of discernment, knowing the difference between a conversation that can go somewhere and a performance that's just looking for an audience. The ninth sign is perhaps the most difficult to explain to someone who doesn't experience it, but if you have this rare personality, you'll know it instantly. You feel homesick for a place you've never been. There's a persistent low-frequency ache somewhere beneath your daily awareness, a sense that you belong to something or somewhere that you haven't found yet. Not a specific city or country, something more abstract. A quality of existence that you've glimpsed in fragments, in certain music, in certain moments in nature, in rare conversations that went deeper than conversations usually go, but that you've never experienced fully or consistently. Jung connected this feeling to the self, not the ego self that navigates daily life, but the larger, deeper center of the total psyche that most people never make conscious contact with. He believed this ache was actually the psyche's recognition of its own unrealized wholeness. You're not homesick for a place. You're homesick for a version of existence where your full self is expressed, where nothing essential is suppressed or hidden or compromised. And because most environments require some degree of suppression, the ache never fully goes away. Jung didn't consider this a pathology. He considered it a compass. The ache points toward what your psyche is trying to become, and the rare personality doesn't numb this feeling or dismiss it. They follow it, even when following it takes them further from everything familiar and closer to something they can only sense but not yet see. The 10th and final sign is one that Jung believed was the culmination of all the others. You've stopped explaining yourself, not in anger, not in resignation, in completion. There was a long phase, maybe years, maybe decades, where you tried to make people understand your inner world. You explained why you needed solitude. You justified why you left things that looked good from the outside. You defended your perceptions when others couldn't see what you saw. You translated yourself constantly, trying to bridge the gap between your experience and everyone else's frame of reference. And then you stopped, not because you gave up on people, because you finally understood something that Jung himself took years to articulate clearly. The rare personality cannot be understood through explanation. It can only be recognized by someone who shares a similar psychological structure. Explaining your inner world to someone who doesn't have the perceptual equipment to receive it isn't communication. It's an exhausting performance of vulnerability that goes nowhere. Jung observed that when rare personalities stopped explaining, they experienced an immediate and profound shift. Energy that had been flowing outward into justification and translation suddenly became available for other things, for creation, for deeper self-understanding, for finding the few people who didn't need the explanation because they already lived in the same frequency. This isn't isolation, it's selection. You stop broadcasting and start listening for the people who already understand. And when you find them, and you do find them, always in unexpected places, the connection is immediate and requires nothing. No explanation, no translation, no defense, just recognition. Jung called these relationships the rarest and most valuable experiences available to the human psyche, because they're the only relationships where the rare personality can exist fully without compression. Now here's what Jung wanted people with these signs to understand, and it's not what you might expect. He didn't congratulate them, he didn't tell them they were better or more evolved. What he told them was that possessing a rare personality structure carries a specific kind of responsibility that most people will never face. You see more clearly, you perceive more deeply, you process on levels that the majority of the population doesn't access. And that means you can't hide behind the excuse of not knowing. You can't pretend you don't see the patterns. You can't act as if your awareness doesn't exist. Jung found that rare personalities who tried to suppress their nature, who shrunk themselves to fit, who performed normalcy to avoid the discomfort of standing out, developed the most severe psychological symptoms he encountered. Depression that no medication could touch, anxiety with no identifiable source, a pervasive sense of meaninglessness that came not from external circumstances, but from the betrayal of their own psychological structure. They were sick because they were living someone else's life, because they were pretending to be ordinary when their psyche was built for something else entirely. The path for the rare personality, Jung believed, wasn't to become more like everyone else. It was to become more completely themselves, even when that meant losing people, leaving environments, and accepting a degree of solitude that most people would find unbearable. Individuation, he called it, the process of becoming undivided, not perfect, not enlightened, undivided, where what you show the world and what you experience internally are finally the same thing, where the persona and the self are no longer at war, where you stop splitting yourself into the acceptable version and the real version and just exist as one coherent being. This is not a comfortable process. Jung was honest about that. It costs friendships that can't survive your authenticity. It ends careers that require your performance. It dismantles belief systems that depend on you not asking the questions your psyche demands you ask. And it creates a life that looks nothing like what you were told a good life should look like, but feels, for the first time, like yours. The rare personality doesn't arrive at this through effort or self-improvement. They arrive at it through surrender, through finally stopping the fight against their own nature and letting their psyche lead them where it's been trying to lead them all along. Jung watched this happen in patient after patient. The ones who stopped resisting their rarity and started honoring it didn't just feel better. They became something he struggled to describe in psychological terms because it bordered on what he could only call whole, present, real in a way that most people perform but never achieve. If you recognized yourself in these 10 signs, I want you to understand something clearly. This isn't about being special. This is about being specific. Your psyche is built with a particular architecture, and that architecture demands a particular kind of life. Ignoring that demand is what creates suffering. Honoring it is what creates meaning. And the gap between those two choices, ignoring versus honoring, is the gap between spending your life performing someone else's version of normal and finally living your own version of real. Jung would tell you that most people choose the performance, not because they're weak, but because the performance is safe, predictable, and rewarded by every system society has built. The rare personality chooses differently, not because they're braver, but because their psyche literally won't let them rest inside a life that doesn't fit. The discomfort of inauthenticity is louder than the discomfort of standing alone. And so they stand alone, again and again, until they find the others who are standing alone too. And then, finally, they stand together. That recognition, that you are not broken, not too much, not too intense, but built with a psychological structure that simply operates differently from the majority, might be the most important thing you ever let yourself accept, not as arrogance, as accuracy, as the beginning of aligning your outer life with your inner architecture instead of forcing your inner architecture to conform to an outer life that was never designed for someone like you. Jung spent his entire career studying the human psyche, and what he concluded at the end of it all was this: the rarest thing a person can become is themselves, not a better version of themselves, not a healed version or an optimized version or a spiritually upgraded version, just themselves, undisguised, uncompressed, unapologetic. And if you've spent your life sensing that you're different in a way you couldn't explain, that something about how you perceive, process, and experience reality doesn't match the template you were handed, you're not wrong, you're rare, and rare isn't easy, but it's yours. If you're ready to take this further, to move from recognizing these signs to actually doing the inner work they're pointing you toward, we put together True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, designed to help you stop performing someone else's version of a life and start building one that fits the architecture of who you actually are. Click below to get your copy.